Hey, sorry, I was just getting down with some Hector Laro. So if you haven't been able to notice, or you don't know by now, that today, yes, today, we are talking about Puerto Ricans, and particularly Puerto Ricans that are stateside. What does that mean, stateside? Puerto Ricans that live in the United States, the continental United States, the 50 states that we have here, because the island of Puerto Rico, located in the Caribbean, is the United States territory, meaning that people that live in the island of Puerto Rico are actually American citizens. So with that being said, welcome to Cultura Vlog 101, and welcome to the segment where we're going to talk about Puerto Ricanos, Boricuas, or better yet, maybe it's known as Puerto Ricans, and a little bit about their culture, their history here in the stateside of the United States, as well as some issues that they face their community in their demographics and numbers. Puerto Ricans in the United States are the second largest Latino group here in the United States, okay? In the continental United States, within the 50 states that we have here, there are a significant amount of numbers of Puerto Ricans. There are 4.6 million Puerto Ricans, okay? So now, is that all the Puerto Ricans there are? No, because there are 4.6 million Puerto Ricans that live within the continental United States, most of that being in states like New York, New Jersey, Florida, Illinois, a fast-growing community that we're growing in parts of Texas, like the Dallas-Fort Worth community, Houston as well. But at the same time, you do have Puerto Ricans that also, of course, live in Puerto Rico, ¿verdad? Okay, and so there are 3.9 million Puerto Ricans that live in the island of Puerto Rico, and the islands that contain, there's a few different islands that contain what is known as the Puerto Rico territory of the United States. So that means there are more Puerto Ricans now that live in the continental United States than there are in Puerto Rico as a few years ago. And so it's pretty interesting. So you have 4.6 million here, and another 4 million of them back home on the island of Puerto Rico, which on the island of Puerto Rico, the vast majority of the people are considered to be living in urbanization. And what that means, they are urbanized because it's such a condensely packed island. 4 million people on a very small island, okay? So you have the community of San Juan, which San Juan has 2.7 million people, and which encompasses the capital city of Puerto Rico, as well as its communities around it, like Carolina. And then you have, you know, its sprawling areas, then you have Ponce in its areas, and then you have all these different larger cities and towns, and they kind of all dotted around the island, and it's growing so much, it's like almost one big, you know, urbanization or island cities in a way, if you kind of figure in that fact. I have a good friend over there right now, and he's talking about how kind of crowded it is, you know, cars and stuff like that. It just kind of has more of a crowded feel because there's so many people that are living on this island, like Isla del Encanto. Like Isla del Encanto means the enchanted island, which is kind of a nickname for Puerto Rico. Another nickname for Puerto Rico is Borican, okay? They call themselves Boricuas. If you live in New York, you know the term Boricua. If you haven't seen the red, white, and blue flag, very similar to the United States flag with a star on it, you probably have seen if you live in New York. Puerto Ricans have really defined themselves as a people within the 20th century when there was a high level of migration from Puerto Rico, especially during the 60s, to the city of New York and to some of these other northeastern cities, like maybe Boston and such, okay? And so you had a lot of them coming from there. Over here, some of them were coming to find better work. Some of them, because of government issues with the United States, were kind of being forced off of their land to kind of almost look for work in the mainland states. A lot of things the United States government did to many Puerto Ricans in the island of Puerto Rico has gone without being told in history. And so I highly recommend watching the documentary Yo Soy Boricua, Pa Que Tu Lo Sepa, by actress Rosie Perez, as she discusses some of the wrongdoings that have happened to her Puerto Rican Boricua people. And so it's really interesting, though. And so within the past several decades, a huge population of Puerto Ricans have been birthed. Like, come on now. Starting out in the 1900s with hardly having any Puerto Ricans, that were living the stateside to now 4.6 million of them. Hey, if something happened a lot in 100 years, okay, and still having 4 million in the back home, they're definitely a larger defined group of people in this country, especially in northeastern communities such as New York City. It is the largest parade in the country. Arguably the first or second largest parade in the country is the Puerto Rican Day Parade, which is held every year in the summer in New York. I have been to it. It's phenomenal. Many reggaeton artists, which is a hip-hop, Spanish hip-hop music that is really big in Puerto Rico and amongst Latino youth, originating from Panama but made extremely famous by Puerto Rican artists such as Daddy Yankee, Don Omar, Tego Calderon. You can see them at this Puerto Rican Day Parade. Salsa singing the Puerto Rican Day Parade. Different Puerto Rican and Latino associations that are really fighting for the rights of the people in the New York area. One thing that you should realize when you talk about the Latino demographic and what the Latino demographic needs, especially in terms of the election and politically, you have to kind of almost break it down, because different Latinos, depending on what nationality or what nation they are, do experience and go through different things. Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and so when you talk about immigration, that is an issue that can affect and does affect a vast majority of Latinos. But the 4.6 Latinos who are here in the United States who are Puerto Rican descent, it's a bit different because they're already born as American citizens. Even if they're born on the island, they don't need a passport to come from the island to go visit or to move and find a job in Miami or in New York City. And so it's interesting to keep these things in mind. I need to check my demographic on this stat real fast, but I believe that, first of all, the city with the most amount of Puerto Ricans or Boricua people is hands down New York City. It's been known as a hub of Puerto Rican culture. You have an area, Spanish Harlem, sitting adjacent to Harlem, an island of Manhattan that's been known as kind of a Puerto Rican hub, aka East Harlem, where you can find a lot of the Puerto Rican people there. I believe, I need to check my stats, I believe it's like 800,000 or so Puerto Ricans live in New York City. And so I'm trying to check my demographics on that, but it's a significant demographic. They really have a presence there. Their presence is known and heard. A lot of issues that are currently facing the Puerto Rican people, most time and historically as they've been in the stateside, have dealt with a lot of big city living issues. You know, things such as being in a larger city, having not great access to education because of their language barrier or the color of their skin, things of that nature. They have issues with, you know, simple things like in New York, not trash not getting picked up in their communities. As in wealthier communities, it will be picked up in inner city problems, and this is kind of a problem that they have really faced, you know, throughout the 70s and 80s into the 90s. But side note, I am seeing a stat that says there's about 800,000 Puerto Ricans that presently live in New York City, okay? And so those are the issues that Puerto Ricans have historically faced. You have the warlord, I'm trying to think, like a really kind of up-and-coming youth group that really was fighting for the Puerto Rican American rights, and to really try to make sure that they have a say-so in their communities. This kind of happened throughout the civil rights movements, the young lords, I'm sorry. And so, kind of the same time, civil rights movement. As blacks are trying to fight for equal rights, you have Puerto Rican communities like in New York trying to fight for equal rights, and how the city deals with them as a population as opposed to maybe wealthier and white affluent communities, okay? Puerto Ricans, you know, it's like saying you're Puerto Rican, like saying you're Texan or saying you're not Chinese in a way. Well, like it's like saying you're Texan and Chinese, okay? Look at it that way. Chinese country, nationality. Puerto Rico has that in a way, but Texas is a state, it's part of the U.S., and Puerto Rico is also a territorial part of the U.S. But skin tone-wise, people come in all different colors. Their background is heavily Spanish, also with other influences like German and Irish and French. It has a strong African cultural influence in the Puerto Rican community, Taino, the Native American, and so many Puerto Ricans are a mix of all these different ethnicities, and some of them are more on one side, or all on one side, and less on the other side. So you have black Puerto Ricans. About 7% of the island of Puerto Rico claims themselves to be black, and 4% claims himself to be mixed, and the other 70% claims to be white. So it's a very diverse background of people that claim that they are Puerto Rican and hail from the Isla del Encanto. Well, that's it for a little bit about Puerto Rican culture. I will see you next time here on Cultura Vlog 101, and we will see what culture I'll talk about next. Adios.